I am appreciative of the invitation to come speak today about pairing livestock with a gardening enterprise. My name is Jedidiah Hewlett. I am in the field office for the University of Wyoming in Douglas. So as we go, please stop if you have questions, but yeah. Who remembers the quote from Animal Farm? George Orwell. All animals are equal, right? Who agrees? Yes? No?
Well,
Some are more equal?
it depends on their destructive abilities.
Exactly. We're going to talk about that.
Because that's what really probably sets any of animals apart, is the livestock is their destructive ability.
Mm-hmm.
How easy you can keep them pinned in, and if they break loose.
Right, right. So I broke these into 4 categories. There might be others, and there's overlap between them. So what are some examples of companion animals we keep commonly? A dog, cat, yep.
Rabbits.
Rabbits, mm-hmm.
Are you saying as livestock?
As livestock.
Okay, I have ducks and chickens.
That's what I was thinking.
Okay.
Some people keep a horse, right?
Yeah. Ducks
So
and chickens.
of those we've mentioned, what would be good for plant control? Goats, right? Weed control, right? Some people refer to their horse hobby as their weed burner, right?
Yes.
So what about insect control?
And
Chickens.
ducks.
Ducks do pretty well. Guineas, I've heard, are
Yes.
pretty hard on insects, and even some snakes. Well, right. Mm-hmm. So then, in the byproduct category, this would be including meat, eggs, milk, what else? Fertilizer, yep.
Yeah, because you have rabbits, because you're getting fertilizer
Mhm.
and meat and skin.
Yep. So there's a lot of overlap there.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing that's become more common lately is wool pellets for fertilizer.
Mm-hmm.
Decompose really well, but you know, if you just shear it and send it off to the mill or whatever, it would be lost as that.
Are they available here? Because the use of wool in your garden is more European than American.
I know there's at least one place in Crowheart that is commercially producing wool pellets.
Because I've heard of it, but everybody I've heard of it is always over in Europe, like on YouTube.
Okay.
They just,
Yeah.
people give away their wool,
Mhm.
and then people get it free and
Right.
used wool and use it as like mulch.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yep.
here you try to find it, and it's like, what?
Yeah. So this place got started during COVID. They bought a pelleting mill with some
Okay.
grant money. And so they're taking basically low-grade wool that would be discounted on the
Yes.
market and turning it into fertilizer pellets, basically.
Yeah,
So,
that's what I've heard of it.
mhm. All right. I've organized a group activity. This is really easy, okay? So everybody close your eyes and imagine your garden space at its best, okay? And if you can think of it being better, maybe that's where you can use your imagination, all right? You got pests under control, everything's booming, doing really well, crop looks good for the year. And then, what's the ideal combination of livestock that you see mixing or not mixing in there?
Poultry getting all the bugs that we don't want in there.
Might be a good option, yeah. All right, so when you have a good image of that, you can open your eyes. Who envisioned something like this? Isn't it cute with all the rabbits drinking out of the garden pond? No. So this is actually an overpopulation of rabbits in Australia, where basically a gift became a curse. And yeah, they basically eat it down to nothing, and they breed like rabbits, right? As we say.
That's what I was gonna say. That's food.
This is what I would imagine of the ideal situation, right? According to artificial intelligence, this is a nice picture, right? If we could get this, I would almost pay money to someone who could do this consistently.
Well, mine's kind of like that at the height of it, because I have a lot
Good.
of shrubs.
Mm-hmm.
Because a girlfriend has pictures, she resent it to me, and because I just have individual, I have my yard cut in half, so the ducks are like in one part and the chickens in another part, so it does kind of look like
Mm-hmm.
that. Not as bright.
Well, it's really hard to manage, right?
Oh yeah, it is.
To
It's-
keep it
it's
green
continuous.
and
I
everything.
spend money on water.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
Here's another example. Generally, sheep and goats are more browse animals, so they eat woody plants, right? But I like this example because the field is full of green grass, right? But the goats are over there against, this is a fence, I don't know if you can see it very well, but they're eating everything that's coming through the fence, right? As their preference. So this is probably okay if you own both sides of the fence, but if this is your neighbors, you might be having a sheriff visit or something, you know? Just something to consider. Sheep are being used a lot to graze under solar panels more and more. That seems to be a good niche they're filling. In reality, sheep and goats will both eat grass, but they do eat woody plants as well. Who has this as their, like, reality you have to live with?
Right now, in the winter.
Mm-hmm. On our chicken runs, we don't ever get anything growing in there because it's always eaten down, right? So if we're gonna try and pair these two worlds, animals and gardening, what are some of the advantages that we could see to doing that?
We did, like I said, pest control is
Mm-hmm.
advantages.
Fertilizer, yep.
I'm still back in fertilizer.
Mm-hmm. It's expensive, right?
Yeah.
And most of our Wyoming soils are not very fertile, right? So they need amending. Mm-hmm.
in some cases, the poultry will actually pick at weeds, right, that are new growth and not necessarily harm the crop so much, depending
Yep.
on how many and how dense and how long you
Mhm.
Mhm.
Right. Yep.
In San Joaquin Valley, they use weeder yeast to keep the cotton rows clean.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting. So, yep, we got fertilizer spreaders on legs, right? Another thing is if you leave animals in, especially soft ground, they'll till a little bit, right? Which can be good and bad. I mean, depending on what season of use you're in there with them and that sort of thing. But weed control is another advantage. What are some disadvantages that we can come up with?
Total destruction.
Yeah. I was gonna
Right.
say-
Yeah.
I was
It's-
gonna say that's exactly it.
Yeah.
fertilizer.
So I said here that animals are non-selective, right? If we think about selective herbicides, sometimes we can kill broadleaves and not grass or vice versa, right? What else? Besides them just eating everything.
Well, the fertilizer thing, because they're fertilizing the
Mhm.
wrong place, the wrong time, the wrong
Yep.
concentration.
And it's hot usually, right? Especially chicken manure. So we'll talk about that a little
The
bit.
weeds might be able to stand that a lot better than the crop you're trying to grow,
Mhm.
which would be another negative, right?
Yep. Ground disturbance again. If you've just planted something and the chickens come in and have a dust bath, how well is that going to grow?
Of viruses, like right now with the bird flu,
Mhm.
it's a disadvantage because you don't know what's gonna do or what people don't understand if you have animals depending on if they're on your out on acreage or you're doing urban farming, backyard farming, I mean, you know.
Yep.
And people get paranoid from the news of bird flu or whatnot, and you have to educate them. So miscommunication, I guess,
Yep.
can be.
And there's a lot of
disadvantage.
areas around animal husbandry that
Yes.
need communication better, probably. And this is kind of a pun intended, but if you're going to add
Yeah.
livestock to something, if it's not something you're already doing, it's going to be extra work on top of your gardening. So it's just something to consider if you have the time and skills to do that. So here are some possible solutions, and there's probably more. Matching, I guess I should say timing is a big thing, right? So sometimes you can leave the garden fallow during the winter. You can pen animals in there. It's not going to hurt anything, and then till everything in before you start in the spring. That's one example. If you just need a natural weed control, right? You might borrow a goat from your neighbor or somebody you know in the area to eat down your weeds for a couple weeks, and then you take it back, right? It's a lot less that you have to manage all year round, right? Sometimes crop insurance might come in a 50-foot roll from the garden supply store, right? If you want chickens around your garden beds to eat grasshoppers and stuff, maybe fencing's the simplest thing, right? Or putting on row covers, depending on your preference there. Composting the manure is a good way to use that fertilizer source in a safer manner. Has anybody come up with other solutions that we haven't talked about yet? A good pairing of livestock and crops.
Nobody mentioned worms. I've just been thinking about that as another, it can actually be a saleable commodity. You know how to harvest them. And your garden tends to be a good place for them to grow, but they increase the viability of your crop in many ways. So
Right.
something to think about.
So back to your competitive enterprises, right? If I have a worm farm on one side and then trying to grow chickens in that space, right? Are they going to eat enough worms that the worm farm is going to suffer? It's a consideration, right? Or
Pocket gophers are quite as appealing, though.
true.
They create tone, but it's not as helpful.
Yep. So I just wanted to review the nitrogen cycle briefly because it's very important to understanding the manure aspect that we'll talk about later. So nitrogen is very important in our environment. It's in 78% of the air we breathe, and it's a building block for proteins, which are basically in all of us and all of animals, right? And we get those through plants. So through nitrogen-fixing bacteria and through other events like lightning strikes, we fix the nitrogen in the atmosphere. It becomes ammonia in the soil. Then through a process called ammonification, it becomes ammonium. And at that point, it is available for plants in the soil. There are some other bacteria that will turn it into like ammonium nitrite or nitrate, which are also able to be taken up by plants. So there's these three different molecules that are available, and then it goes into the plants, the animals, and then it kind of completes that cycle. On the other side of this, I guess is not really listed here, but volatilization is another route, right? So it can return to the atmosphere as just N2, which is just two molecules bonded together. And that's really unuseful for plants or animals because it's a triple covalent bond, and that bond is really hard to break unless it's through a bacterial action or through lightning, as I mentioned. So here are some problems with using fresh manure. Number one is any weed seed that goes through any animal is viable out the other end. So it doesn't matter whether it's through a beef cow or a chicken. My best example is if you think about the fence lines that have cedar trees growing in them. a lot of the birds ate the cedar trees that were in the shelter belt, rested on the fence, pooped it out, and then flew on, right? So we spread seeds and manure quite easily. Manure also is very high in salts and nitrogen, which is our big one for fertilizer, right? It can be problematic if we put it on too heavy. Also, they're in dog and cat manure especially, but also hogs and chickens. Pathogens can survive, mainly E. coli and salmonella, which are life-threatening to humans if we're infected with those. And it's also rich in phosphorus and potassium. So I read in, I think it was Utah State University, they recommended balancing your soil test with manure based on the phosphorus content, and then adding nitrogen beyond that is nitrogen-only fertilizer, because if you put on to meet nitrogen needs of the soil, your phosphorus will be over the top and your plants will actually suffer because of it.
So how long should your like beef manure be sitting when everything starts to break down?
We're going to talk about
Oh,
breakdown of
okay.
manure.
Okay,
Yep.
sorry, I just-
Sorry. Yeah. So this is some data that came out of Nebraska, basically just fresh manure content. You'll notice here there's ammonium and then the organic nitrogen components here. Organic doesn't mean like crop organic, it means bound to carbon organic, okay? So in all manures there's a balance, right, of the ammonium, which is available to plants, and then the carbon or the organic nitrogen, which is tied up with carbon. So beef has relatively, and this also depends on how the manure is collected. So in a beef dry lot situation, there's not a lot of ammonium compared to the organic nitrogen. Chickens are kind of the reverse, where they have a lot more ammonium and a lot more organic nitrogen as well. Does anybody know the reason why it's so high in poultry?
Maybe not a urinary system?
Exactly. It's combined with poultry, right? It's in one pellet basically. So all that ammonium is going into the product of the manure with poultry. So this is just another representation of the different levels. Swine is also pretty high in ammonium, but it also depends here. Yeah, so they've got dairy liquid versus solid broken out. You can see the total nitrogen is higher in the liquid because it is catching all the urine. But then in the dry lot, basically just cow patties, it won't have that ammonium in it. So you can see ammonium's pretty low versus the liquid slurry they would get off of a dairy farm. And then, yeah, swine and poultry pretty high in the nitrogen content. It's really, really easy to see here. Just, again, that differentiation between the organic and inorganic nitrogen. Yes?
How would, and you don't have horses listed up there
That's what I was
as
just
a
gonna ask.
livestock, but I know horse manure is higher in nitrogen, because you're not supposed to put that, you're supposed, if you're gonna put it on, you put that on in the fall, so it can get snowed on, get rained on, and
Mhm.
it leaches into the soil. Is that because it's like chicken manure, or is it as hot as chicken manure?
Well, that would be just I think there's another graph here. It has horse on it.
Yeah, there it is.
Yep. So nitrogen percentage, you can see it ranges from, looks like rabbit is or turkey's the highest, 3%. And I don't know if this is by volume or by weight, but so horse is 0.7, comparable to beef. So it's, I mean, by these numbers, they didn't find that it was that different in the nitrogen content.
So horse manure has a high fiber content. So
Right.
that has to decompose as a composting action, and that creates a heating that's different than the nitrogen measure of hot when we say hot. That's
Right, right.
hard to mention, yeah.
I think most of the time when people say a manure is hot, it's because it has a high component that's available to plants immediately. And so without any time to mellow that out or break it down, it would be like pouring like straight fertilizer that's, you know, a commercial product onto that plant. And we know that you can get burnt spots in your lawn from the dog peeing or whatever, right? It's kind of the same concept. So these are some numbers from the FAO for electrical conductivity of water. Salt changes that. So this is the salt content in seawater and then regular irrigation water. If electrical conductivity gets over 2, and that's decisiemens per meter, I believe, plants will have a hard time processing that much salt. So if we look at that and compare it to some of our manures, alpaca's pretty high in salts, but also chicken, dairy, and turkey are pretty high as, I mean, not even talking about nitrogen, right? This is salt. And so when we try to incorporate these into our soil, it will not only change the pH, which is also listed here, most of those are over 7, so it would be pushing us towards a more alkaline condition, which most of Wyoming soils suffer from anyway. So just something to keep in mind. Carbon-nitrogen ratio we will come back to in a minute. So you might be wondering why composting so good? Basically, you get to control everything that goes into it. A lot of commercial compost that you can get from your landfill or other sources will have, I mean, you don't know what's in them, but I've heard that even if you compost grass that had a chemical on it, like an herbicide, that will affect your garden when you put it on. So if you want to avoid that, doing it yourself is one way to control those variables. And it's really easy to do. You can compost almost anything that's non-plastic, right? From wool to manure, your household kitchen scraps. And in the end, if we are livestock farmers, we turn something that's waste into something that is very beneficial. And from the manure side, it's better because if composting is done right, it will kill the weed seeds and it will kill those pathogens that might be harmful to human health as an amendment to a food crop. So composting really requires 3 things: food, air, and water. Obviously in Wyoming, we're pretty limited on water, so that's one thing you're going to have to stay on top of to get a good compost going. Food comes in the form of carbon and nitrogen in its basic elemental forms, but it's trying to feed those microbes that are decomposing the material. And they need oxygen to breathe, so that's why mixing is very important, but also the moisture helps break down that product as well. There's lots of different ways you can compost depending on what your preferences are and your environment. It's best to get a good mix of carbon and nitrogen because your pile can smell really bad if you get too much nitrogen in there. So if that's the condition you're dealing with, try adding more carbon sources, okay? And we'll talk about a little more of those in a minute. But these are just simple wire cages, right, that don't even have a bottom. So the material you'd put in, these are in layers, right? It wouldn't have to be in layers necessarily. You can mix it all as you add it. But a lot of people use those, it's like a big black drum that can turn on a stand. I think From what I've read, that's probably the fastest way to make compost, because even during the winter, those will catch a lot of solar gain, right? Warm up in there. It's a closed system, right? So everything you put in stays in there. If it's a little too wet, drain it, right? If you need to add water, you can definitely put some of that in there.
I do have one, made their compost in minimal amount of time, but anything of any significant size is still in there, so it's not a true compost. But it's, it's good organic matter, but it's extremely labor sensitive.
Intensive?
Intensive thing.
Okay.
And it was never worth it.
Okay.
It just took too much time.
I have heard you can compost in bags, but this is really interesting because that is a anaerobic environment, right? If you seal it all up, decomposition will happen, but it's a different mix of microbes that do that as compared to one in a pile that's out in open air, and prefer the air for their life cycle. So if you compost in open air, turning is regular turning is important to kind of keep those microbes happy. And you want to add enough water to where it has a wet sponge consistency. If it's wringing wet, that's too much. But if you can't feel any dampness or it doesn't really stick together, that's probably too dry. And then avoiding dairy products, cooking oils, and meats is a good idea because those often smell and attract critters that you probably don't want coming around eating your stuff. So just, you had alluded to this already, but particle size is a big consideration in decomposition, right? In both these pictures, there's decomposition happening, but one might be over 100 years, right? And we're usually trying to get compost in a shorter span than that, right? So reducing the particle size increases surface area and it increases the amount that the microbes can work. USDA has established, it's actually in a code of federal regulations for America, that compost, to be considered organic compost, has to reach at least a minimum of 131 degrees for at least 3 days in a bin setting, or in a windrow setting, it has to stay that hot for 15 days. So most people will get a long-stemmed probe thermometer to monitor the temperature of their compost pile. That gives you a really hard and fast way of monitoring whether you're reaching that benchmark or not. And then it depends on the environment again. If you're hot or warm and wet, usually things break down faster than if you're cold and dry, like in Wyoming. But most of the recommendations I've seen say that maintaining a decent size 3-foot or so compost pile will give you the best chances of getting that heat generation, and it also gives you some thermal mass to keep that material warm. And then at the end, it should look and smell like soil. So if you can still see hay pieces or manure pieces or your orange rinds, whatever you put in there, if it's not looking like black earth, basically, it's not quite yet done yet. Just some guidelines here. I did mention the carbon-nitrogen ratio before. In the browns category, those are more heavy in carbon, so our papers, wood products, pretty much anything that comes, straw and hay or pine needles are also rich in carbon. And then on the green side, those are usually richer in nitrogen. So your fresh grass clippings, manure is a big one, and then food scraps are usually higher in nitrogen as well. And this table gives some of those breakdowns. Kitchen scraps are 15 to 20, grass clippings 15 to 25. So 30 to 1 is ideal, is what all the recommendations I've read. So if you can balance, if you've got wood shavings or straw and you're adding it with your manure, kind of try and mix that up. And so it's almost like if you think about the carbon as like your steak dinner and the nitrogen's the cake at the end. Nitrogen goes quick, but then your population of microbes just tank. So to keep them going, you gotta balance both, if that makes sense. And then I really like this graphic that shows how animals are basically nitrogen concentrators from the environment. So if we have this plant that starts out at 20-1, the manure becomes 10-1, and then, the urine's 5-1. So it's just concentrating the nitrogen that comes out of the atmosphere again. And then as we use that, we're completing the nitrogen cycle and enriching the soil as well. So this is the same table from Utah State University, but this is the compost after the manure's been through the composting process. So yeah, nitrogen, again, hovering around 1%. Again, probably best to balance your soil test with the phosphorus and not the nitrogen. pH is something to keep in mind as well. If you need to acidify your soil to bring that back down into something that's tolerable by plants, definitely do that. And one thing I thought was interesting is the salinity is still there, right? So a lot of times we like leach salts out with water, right? So maybe that's what you're gonna have to do if you're gonna use a lot of manure. And then interestingly, carbon to nitrogen ratio does vary quite a bit across species. So beef is right around 12. It says dairy is as well. Horse is a lot higher, right? Again, back to the fiber content, the carbon content, right? Makes sense. Looks like mink would be the lowest on their list there, but I don't know anybody who raises that. So. Interesting fun fact. This kind of ties everything together. Again, decomposing happens all the time, but if we want compost in a relatively short amount of time, sometimes we need to add moisture, right, to make it more tolerable for the microbes. Sometimes I've never heard of anybody heating their compost, but if the microbes do a lot of activity, they will heat that compost, and sometimes you'll see them steaming in the wintertime especially. Food sources, again, if you want a faster breakdown, add more nitrogen, but to a point, because you still need carbon to keep those microbes happy as well. And we mentioned particle size. The only one thing I have to say about this is, yes, you increase the surface area for those microbes, but if you get it too small and you're making a slurry, I'm guessing you're going to be matting things so tightly that air is not going to be getting into your pile, right? So again, it's a little bit of a balance. Any questions about that or anything we've talked about so far?
Well, the biggest problem I have with the composting is not being able to find, I live out on the east side to where the wind blows any leaf or anything else out. I mean, I'm probably, anything that drops in my yard is probably in Nebraska by the end of the day, who knows?
Yeah.
So where do I get these kind of things that because I'm still worried about the organic composition of it. I don't want to just go to any Joe Blow and, oh, hey, can I have your leaves, or can I have this, when I don't know what they've sprayed, or even the town's shredding big piles that they have. How do I know, you know, I mean, where do I get the other stuff that I need?
I mean, yeah, one thing I could suggest is maybe using social media or something. You could contact someone in town that is raking piles of leaves, right? Say, I'll come get them or something, right?
Or you can go rake them.
Right.
Yeah, and I
Yeah.
don't mind doing that, as long as I know they haven't been spraying some kind of glyphosate or something, cause I don't want that stuff anywhere near my place.
Right.
So, that's my biggest concern with, how do I get that stuff, and that's what I'm running into. My biggest problem is, okay, I have more food waste in my compost.
Right,
And
right.
then I have to sit there and shred the cardboard type thing.
Yeah.
I checked with like the garden club, I mean, Laramie has a garden club in town that they work with, different people. They have lots of, depending on who they are, they have different resources that they reach out to, their friends or that
Yeah.
just might not know about.
Well, and,
Pick their brain and find
I
out
mean,
what they're using.
if it comes to it, right, you can go get pet bedding from the farm store, right?
Try
That-
not to spend that money.
Right,
but-
right. But if it came to that, you could do that.
Yeah.
Alternatively, you could go talk to maybe a lumber mill or something, get some free wood chips. I know there's one down the road from us, and it seems like they can't give it away. It just keeps piling and piling and piling outside their
Along
building.
Along that same thing, I have a wood chipper that I use for mine.
Mhm.
I just run them in there, and I use them more for chicken bedding than anything.
Sure.
But I mean, the chipper, I got a steal on them, but
Mhm.
they're actually expensive, but you can find them for cheap, and they do a great job. It looks like just the picture you had,
Mhm.
very small chips in there.
Yeah.
That's always an option, chip your own.
Maybe looking into 4-H clubs or the 4-H kids that are growing, animals for fair, going, talking to them, a local county agent,
Well, that's what I was saying, because there's the Wits End cattle,
Yep.
she's selling their manure. I already talked to her, and it's $10 to $20 a truckload. But that's why I was asking is.
horse manure for you.
Oh, okay. Well, but see, that's where,
We
okay.
have a horse refuge, we have
Oh,
lots.
okay, but see,
Years
that's
old.
where I was getting to the question. This is why I was asking, how long do we wait? Because Catherine Weiser, she is pro anti-animal manure because of the salinity and because of everything coming through the gut can come
Yeah.
out.
Yeah.
So that's where I was getting, I'm starting to ask people, well, how old is your piles? And do you turn your piles?
Mhm.
And is it a year old? How long do we wait? Do we ask our friend, can we have some of your poop?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's why I'm asking you.
So-
Where's the
So the
cutoff?
the health concerns
Yes.
are pretty much gone in 120 days.
Okay,
If it's
that's
properly
what I need.
composted.
120 days. for
4
health
months.
concerns.
So,
That's reaching certain temperature.
right, that's like it's watered, it's heated, it's broken down, it's turned, like several iterations of that process go
So,
before,
That's the least.
yeah.
But if it was like a year or longer, then it's even better.
Mhm.
Okay, because I said, well, is it at least a year old? And she's like, yes.
Yeah.
So then it's really safe the longer you go along with it.
Mhm. Yep. And I've heard even people of composting their manure,
Yes.
and then there's this curing period, and
I've heard that
I
too.
don't exactly understand all that, but
And so that's what I was just wondering.
yeah. So,
And people who have manure aren't maybe likely to turn it and water it.
Exactly, that's what I
But you
asked.
can get it and leave
do
it on
like
your
that.
place and
Yeah.
turn it and
Yeah.
water it.
Well,
Mhm.
I just figure if it's at least a year old, even if it's been sitting in that pile, it's gotten enough weather usually that you can still check it, like you said, and
But
do
if you
stuff.
put more carbon with it and
Yeah.
actually build a pile, you'll
Yeah.
get a lot more
So-
composting happening.
Yeah, yeah.
You get this process to occur where if you just used it, it would be not
Yes.
composted on the outside of the pile.
Yeah,
sitting
but
there.
versus on the inside, yes.
Mhm.
That's what I was-
Right,
yeah.
right.
Following what you just said is to mix it in with what you're already doing in the
Yes.
good compost, and then you'll get a lot more action in a lot of different ways.
yeah.
Another point, other than wood chips, you might think about, because you have wheat farmers over here,
Yeah,
is
that's what I
straw.
was
I mean,
Mhm.
that's not available everywhere in Wyoming, but you guys have the luxury of having straw available nearby. And so if your pile's not too
Yeah.
big, that's a great
Yeah,
source. of
Jack's,
straw.
when it was Jack's, they used that, the cheapest straw by bale was from Jack's.
Yeah,
Because I did do that, buy bales and just spread it out, because then the chickens and ducks spread it out.
sure.
Mhm.
And then you just put the compost on top and let them let everybody
There you go.
Yep.
do their work.
So I have a question.
Mhm.
Depending on what the animals are being fed, Will that also affect the composting process?
I know some herbicides, it's on the label that there's restricted movement because there's residual in the manure.
Okay.
So I don't know if you have a specific example.
Well, I just,
Of-
like, okay, just say you have grass-fed compared to grain,
Mhm.
and just something like that. Not like antibiotics or anything that you're feeding them.
Sure. So there is the possibility that there will be certain pesticides or herbicides that will survive the gut. And so the best way to test for that is to take a sample basically and either culture, like try to grow a medium, like sprout some seeds in it and see if it's bad or not. But then you can also get a test, just like a soil test, that will tell you the different, especially on the nutrient side, so that you're not over applying. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, we don't spray anything, ours is just rangeland, but I was just
Mhm.
curious. So.
Yeah. Good questions. To tie this up, I was going to share a personal story with you. So I was living at a place in Nebraska, central Nebraska. It's like 30 miles south of Hastings, 20 miles north of the Kansas border. So we had lots of sun, lots of rain, right? High turnover of nutrients compared to here, at least where I grew up. So I got my little chicken tractor from somebody. It was secondhand, did some repairs on it, and got myself some 6 laying hens and became the backyard research scientist, right? That we all dream of being. This lawn had some dogs in it, I heard, and it wasn't doing very well. Obviously, lots of carbon content on there, right? They didn't rake the leaves. So I thought, well, I'm going to move this chicken tractor around and grow some grass. So I bought the, average grass mix you can find at Baumgar's, and I would sprinkle that down before I moved them, and then I would put scratch down so that they would scratch it in, and then I was also feeding them on the side, but usually I would come back at the end of the day and most of their feed would still be in the bin, and they were eating grass. So
The grass seed.
they are pretty good grazers. This is 2 months later in July.
Nice.
This is not the grass I seeded. I found out later there's a lot of foxtail and windmill grass that came in later in the summer because it's a warm season grass, so it didn't start till later in the summer. But there's a few places, I don't know if you can tell really, but I mean I could tell there were new seedlings that came up. They were different green, right? And you can tell here where I have had them pastured most recently, but the big benefit was I was getting eggs and I didn't really care, right? Funny, excuse me, funny story about this was I was trying to be regenerative, right? Leaving the grass grow, getting seed production, reseeding, right? And apparently the city ordinance was that you needed to keep your grass mowed, or they were going to turn off the utilities. So I had to mow the grass down in the end. I was very content to leave them roaming around and eating my hard-won forage, right? But this is just an example that just because you have the space doesn't mean you can do whatever you want. and also you have to operate within your environmental constraints, right? Yes, question?
So the grass, there wasn't much grass there before. So was the grass seed that you were feeding, the chickens were eating that and pooping it out?
I was not feeding the seed. I was just scattering it before I moved them onto the place.
But would they have eaten some of
They
this?
could have, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And like, besides the manure,
Yep.
they were spreading the grass seed?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Also, I mean, the amount that 6 hens are putting down in one day, I was usually moving them once a day. So the residence time in each of these places is not very long. They weren't taking it down to dirt. They weren't hurting the grass really, right? Just kind of knocking it back. And then with high rainfall the ability to irrigate, like your concerns with salts again and the nitrogen, it goes way down if you're not putting it on in high concentrations, if that makes sense.
So if you spread it out thinly
Mhm.
versus thickly, then you're
Right.
breaking it.
Yep. So, here's some examples I've seen. We already talked about penning the animals in your garden area for the off season. Then you take them out during the growing season. Again, that 4-month waiting time is really important if you're going to be growing food crops in there. You can put them back in the fall if you want. Another thing I've seen is creating the run basically around your garden so that any bugs that come into those spaces will get eaten. But again, you can mix it up however you want. And so that's kind of where we'll end. Is it's all dependent on what you want to do, right? If livestock and gardening pair well on your place or not, it's kind of based on your resource constraints and whether you want to put the effort into doing it. So with that, I think we are out of time. So are there any questions that we haven't covered yet?